There's a family in a town called Elmore, where the father has the emotional intelligence of a 12-year-old. The mother is one breakdown away from a complete psychological collapse, and the children are growing up in an environment so chaotic that a licensed therapist would struggle to know where to begin. On the surface, The Amazing World of Gumball is a cartoon about a blue cat and his family getting into silly situations. It's fast, it's funny, it's creative, and it's one of the most visually inventive animated shows ever made. But here's what most people don't talk about. If you took the Watterson family, exactly as they're portrayed in the show, and placed them in front of a licensed psychologist, the session would not be short, and the diagnosis would not be simple, because the Wattersons aren't just a funny cartoon family. They are, when examined through the lens of actual psychological frameworks, one of the most accurate and most disturbing portraits of family dysfunction ever animated. And I don't say that lightly. Over the next few hours, we're going to do something that nobody has done before. We're going to sit down with the Wattersons, every member, one by one, and examine them the way a real psychologist would. Not with fan theories, not with headcanon, with real diagnostic criteria, real psychological framework, real attachment theory, real trauma model. The kind of analysis that would happen if Nicole Watterson actually walked into a therapist's office and started talking about her life. What we'll find is that almost every comedic element of this show, the chaos, the destruction, the constant emotional whiplash, maps onto recognized patterns of psychological dysfunction. The humor isn't random. The family dynamics aren't arbitrary. Whether the creators intended it or not, they built a family that a psychology textbook could use as a case study. So settle in, get comfortable. This is going to be a long one, and by the end, you might not watch The Amazing World of Gumball the same way again. If you enjoy deep dives like this, subscribe to Cortoon. We go places other channels won't. Now let's begin with the woman holding this entire family together by sheer force of will. Let's talk about Nicole. Before we begin, I want to be transparent about how this analysis works. We're applying real psychological frameworks to fictional characters. That means we're using the characters' depicted behaviors, dialogue, and interactions as our data, the same way a psychologist would use observed behavior and self-reported information to form an assessment of a real person. The frameworks we'll be using include the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, the DSM-5, which is the standard reference used by mental health professionals to classify psychological conditions. We'll also be using Bowlby's attachment theory, which describes how early relationships with caregivers shape emotional development. We'll reference Murray Bowen's family systems theory, which examines how families function as interconnected emotional units. We'll draw on the work of John Gottman, whose research on marital dynamics has identified specific patterns that predict relationship success or failure. And we'll use developmental psychology frameworks from Erik Erikson and Jean Piaget to examine how the Watterson children's environments are affecting their psychological growth. These are not obscure or controversial frameworks. They are the foundational tools of modern clinical psychology, used every day by therapists, counselors, and researchers around the world. And when you apply them to the Wattersons, the results are remarkable. Not because the show gets things wrong, but because it gets things right in ways that are almost eerily precise. One important caveat: diagnosing fictional characters is inherently limited. We can't interview them. We can't administer standardized tests. We're working with behavior as depicted by writers who may not have had these frameworks in mind. So everything that follows should be understood as consistent with, rather than definitively diagnosed as. A real psychologist would say the same thing about any preliminary assessment. With that said, let's begin. Before we examine individual family members, we need to understand how the family functions as a unit. Because in psychology, families aren't just collections of individuals. They're systems. And systems have properties that can't be understood by looking at any single member in isolation. Murray Bowen, one of the founding figures of family therapy, developed family systems theory in the 1950s and 60s. His core insight was that families operate like organisms, interconnected networks where every member's behavior affects every other member. Change one element of the system, and the entire system shifts. Dysfunction in one member isn't just that person's problem. It's a symptom of the system's overall functioning. Bowen identified several key concepts that are directly relevant to the Wattersons. Let's walk through them. Differentiation of self is the degree to which a person can maintain their own identity and emotional stability while remaining connected to their family. People with high differentiation can think clearly under stress, make decisions based on their own values, and tolerate disagreement without becoming emotionally reactive. People with low differentiation tend to fuse with others, absorbing their emotions, losing their sense of self in relationships, and reacting to stress with either emotional explosions or emotional withdrawal. In the Watterson household, the levels of differentiation are dramatically uneven. Nicole operates at a moderate level. She has a strong sense of identity and can function under extreme stress, but she is also deeply fused with her role as the family's caretaker, to the point where her entire self-concept is built around holding the family together. Richard operates at an extremely low level of differentiation. He has almost no independent sense of self, is entirely reactive to his immediate emotional state, and relies completely on Nicole to structure his reality. The children fall at various points along this spectrum, as we'll explore in detail. Triangulation is the process by which two people in conflict draw a third person into their dynamic to stabilize the relationship. Instead of resolving tension directly, the two original parties redirect their anxiety through the third person. This is extraordinarily common in families, and it's one of the most visible dynamics in the Watterson household. Nicole and Richard's marriage contains significant unresolved tension, primarily around Richard's inability to function as an equal partner, and Nicole's resentment about carrying the family's entire practical and emotional burden. Rather than addressing this tension directly, it frequently gets routed through the children. Gumball, in particular, often serves as the triangulated third party, absorbing his parents' anxiety, acting out in ways that redirect the family's attention away from the marital dysfunction, and serving as a lightning rod for Nicole's frustration when her real frustration is with Richard. If you've ever noticed that Nicole seems disproportionately hard on Gumball compared to the other children, this is why. It's not that she loves him less. It's that the family system has positioned him as the outlet for anxiety that actually originates in the marital relationship. This is a textbook example of triangulation, and family therapists see it constantly in clinical practice. Emotional cutoff occurs when family members manage unresolved emotional issues by reducing or completely severing contact with certain family members. It's not the same as healthy boundary setting. It's an avoidance strategy that creates the illusion of resolution without actually resolving anything. Nicole's relationship with her own parents shows clear signs of emotional cutoff. From what the show depicts, Nicole's upbringing was characterized by extremely high expectations, emotional coldness, and conditional approval. Her response, as an adult, has been to largely separate from her family of origin, creating physical and emotional distance from her parents. This might look like independence, but in Bowen's framework, it's actually a sign of unresolved attachment issues. Nicole didn't work through her childhood experiences. She ran from them, and the patterns she absorbed from her parents, the hypervigilance, the need for control, the difficulty expressing vulnerability, followed her into her own family. The nuclear family emotional system describes 4 patterns that Bowen observed in families under stress: marital conflict, dysfunction in one spouse, impairment of one or more children, and emotional distance. Most families exhibit some combination of these patterns, and the Wattersons exhibit all 4 simultaneously. Marital conflict. Nicole and Richard have fundamentally incompatible approaches to life. Nicole is hyper-responsible. Richard is irresponsible. This creates a persistent tension that surfaces regularly as arguments, resentment, and passive-aggressive dynamics. Dysfunction in one spouse. Richard's inability to function as a competent adult, to hold a job, maintain the household, or parent effectively, is not just a character trait. It's a systemic dysfunction that forces the rest of the family to compensate. Impairment of children. Gumball's behavioral issues, Darwin's excessive need for approval, and Ananias's emotional precocity are all, in a family systems framework, predictable responses to the specific type of dysfunction present in the Watterson household. Emotional distance. Despite living in close quarters and interacting constantly, the Wattersons exhibit significant emotional distance. Nicole's emotions are largely suppressed or expressed as anger rather than vulnerability. Richard's emotional expression is childlike and self-centered rather than relational. The children have learned to navigate the family's emotional landscape through performance, being funny, being helpful, being smart, rather than through genuine emotional connection. This is the system. This is the organism. Every individual analysis that follows needs to be understood in this context, because no Watterson exists in isolation. They are all, every single one of them, products of this system, shaped by it, trapped in it, and unconsciously perpetuating it. Now let's look at the individuals. And let's start with the one who carries the heaviest load. Nicole Watterson is, by virtually any measure, the most psychologically complex character in the amazing world of Gumball. She is the family's primary breadwinner, its emotional anchor, its disciplinarian, its protector, and its last line of defense against total collapse. She is also, when examined through a clinical lens, a person who is exhibiting clear signs of chronic psychological distress that she has been suppressing for years. Let's start with what we can observe. Nicole works at the Rainbow Factory. She is, as far as the show depicts, the family's sole source of reliable income. She manages the household. She handles the bills. She deals with the children's school issues. She cleans. She cooks. She makes decisions. She solves problems. When something goes catastrophically wrong, which, in the Watterson household, happens with extraordinary frequency, Nicole is the one who fixes it. She does all of this while married to a man who contributes almost nothing to the practical functioning of the household. Richard does not work. He does not clean effectively. He does not cook nutritious meals. He does not manage finances. He does not help with homework. He does not discipline the children in any consistent or effective way. He is, in functional terms, an additional dependent rather than a partner. A psychologist looking at Nicole's situation would immediately recognize a pattern called caretaker burnout, sometimes referred to in clinical literature as compassion fatigue, or, in the specific context of parenting, parental burnout. This is a recognized psychological condition characterized by emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. It's most commonly associated with caregiving professions, nursing, social work, therapy, but it also occurs in individuals who are functioning as the sole responsible adult in a household. The symptoms of parental burnout, as identified by researchers Moira Mikolajczak and Isabel Roscom at the University of Louvain, include overwhelming exhaustion related to one's parenting role, emotional distancing from one's children, a sense of being an ineffective parent despite evidence to the contrary, and a stark contrast between the parent one imagined being and the parent one has become. Nicole exhibits every single one of these symptoms at various points in the show. Her exhaustion is visible. There are episodes where Nicole is depicted as running on fumes, dark circles under eyes, shortened temper, mechanical movements. Her emotional distancing manifests as the sudden switches between warmth and rage that characterize many of her interactions with the children. Her sense of ineffectiveness surfaces in episodes where she questions whether her sacrifices are making any difference. And the contrast between her aspirations and her reality is a recurring source of pain that the show explores in some of its most emotionally powerful episodes. But caretaker burnout is a description of Nicole's current state. To understand how she got here, we need to go deeper into her history, her attachment patterns, and the psychological architecture that was built in her childhood. John Bowlby's attachment theory, developed in the 1950s and expanded by Mary Ainsworth's research in the 1970s, proposes that the emotional bond between a child and their primary caregiver forms the foundation for all subsequent relationships. The quality of this bond, secure or insecure, shapes how a person relates to others, manages emotions, and copes with stress for the rest of their life. Ainsworth identified 3 primary attachment styles in children, later expanded to 4 by researchers Main and Solomon. They are secure attachment, anxious ambivalent attachment, avoidant attachment, and disorganized attachment. Based on what the show depicts of Nicole's childhood, she most closely fits the pattern of anxious avoidant attachment, sometimes simply called avoidant attachment. Children who develop avoidant attachment typically have caregivers who are emotionally unavailable, dismissive of the child's emotional needs, or who respond to displays of emotion with disapproval or withdrawal. The child learns that expressing vulnerability leads to rejection, and they adapt by suppressing their emotional needs, becoming self-reliant to an extreme degree, and developing an outward appearance of independence that masks a deep, unmet need for connection. The show gives us glimpses of Nicole's upbringing that are consistent with this pattern. Her parents, particularly her mother, are depicted as demanding, critical, and emotionally withholding. Nicole was held to extremely high standards, with approval contingent on performance rather than unconditional. Expressions of weakness or vulnerability were not tolerated. The message Nicole internalized was clear. Your value comes from what you can do, not from who you are. Love is earned through competence, and it can be lost through failure. This internalized message is the engine that drives Nicole's entire adult personality. Her relentless competence, her inability to delegate, her difficulty expressing vulnerability, her tendency to express distress as anger rather than sadness. All of these are classic manifestations of avoidant attachment in adulthood. In the adult attachment literature, this pattern is sometimes called dismissive avoidant attachment. Adults with this style tend to be highly self-reliant, uncomfortable with emotional intimacy, and prone to suppressing their own needs in favor of maintaining control. They are often perceived by others as strong, capable, and unemotional, not because they don't feel, but because they've learned that feeling is dangerous. Nicole feels. The show makes this abundantly clear. There are episodes where her emotional suppression fails, where the pressure she's been containing breaks through in explosive anger, in moments of tearful vulnerability, or in physical manifestations of stress. These breakdowns are not signs of weakness. They are the inevitable consequence of a system, both the internal psychological system and the external family system, that requires one person to carry an unsustainable load without adequate support. A psychologist working with Nicole would likely focus on several key areas. First, challenging her core belief that her value is contingent on her productivity and competence. This belief, installed in childhood, drives her to take on more than any one person can handle, and to interpret any failure, even a minor one, as evidence of her fundamental inadequacy. Second, helping her develop the capacity to express vulnerability without experiencing it as a threat to her identity. Nicole's anger is, in many cases, a secondary emotion. It's what shows up when she can't allow herself to show what's actually underneath, which is usually fear, sadness, or exhaustion. Third, addressing the marital dynamic that requires her to function as both the adult partner and the parent of her husband. This dynamic is not sustainable, and until it changes, no amount of individual therapy will resolve Nicole's burnout. Nicole's anger is one of the show's most iconic features. Her rage is depicted as an almost superhuman force. She becomes physically powerful, her eyes change, she moves with terrifying speed and intensity. It's played for comedy, and it's very effective comedy. But underneath the exaggeration, the emotional dynamics are real. In psychology, anger is classified as a secondary emotion. This means that anger is almost never the primary feeling. It's a response to a deeper, more vulnerable emotion that the person either can't access or won't allow themselves to feel. The most common primary emotions beneath anger are fear, shame, hurt, and helplessness. Nicole's anger fits this model precisely. When does she become enraged? When the household is out of control and she feels helpless to fix it. When Richard has done something that puts the family at risk and she feels afraid. When her efforts go unrecognized and she feels hurt. When she's made a mistake and she feels shame. In every case, the anger is a protective mechanism. It converts a vulnerable emotion, one that her avoidant attachment style tells her is dangerous to express, into a powerful emotion that restores her sense of control. Rage doesn't make you feel small. It makes you feel big. And for someone whose entire psychological structure is built around maintaining control and competence, the transition from helplessness to rage is not just understandable, it's automatic. The clinical term for this process is affect substitution, the unconscious replacement of one emotion with another that feels more tolerable. It's extremely common in people with avoidant attachment styles, and it's one of the primary mechanisms by which emotional suppression creates interpersonal damage. Because the anger, while it serves Nicole's internal need for control, is experienced by her family as unpredictable and frightening. The children don't see a mother who is scared and exhausted. They see a mother who might explode at any moment. And that unpredictability has consequences for their development that we'll explore when we get to each child. A therapist would recognize Nicole's rage pattern immediately and would likely work with her to identify the vulnerable emotions beneath the anger, to slow down the automatic process by which fear becomes fury, and to help her develop alternative ways of expressing those emotions that don't involve the explosive release that has become her default. This work would be difficult for Nicole, not because she's resistant to growth. The show depicts her as someone who genuinely wants to be better, but because her entire identity is built around being the strong one. Accessing vulnerability doesn't just mean changing a behavior. It means dismantling a self-concept that has been keeping her functional for decades. That's terrifying work, and it's work that can't happen in isolation. It requires a family system that can hold her vulnerability safely. Whether the Watterson system is capable of that is an open question. There's a pattern in Nicole's behavior that a clinician would flag as particularly concerning, because it's a pattern that tends to escalate over time if not addressed. The cycle works like this. Nicole absorbs stress. She takes on responsibilities, manages crises, suppresses her own needs, and maintains the family's functioning through sheer force of will. She does this for as long as she can, which, given her considerable psychological resources, is usually quite a long time. But the stress doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And because Nicole has no effective outlet for it, no equal partner to share the load, no space where she can be vulnerable, no system of support that acknowledges what she's carrying, the pressure builds until it exceeds her capacity for containment. And then she explodes. The explosion is dramatic, frightening, and often disproportionate to the triggering event. Something relatively minor, a mess in the kitchen, a broken appliance, Gumball's latest misadventure, triggers a response that belongs to months of accumulated frustration rather than to the immediate situation. The family is confused and frightened. Nicole is ashamed. She pulls herself together, apologizes, or simply moves on, and the cycle begins again. This is what psychologists call a build-up-release cycle. And it's characteristic of people who have poor access to their own emotional states and limited tools for processing stress in real time. Instead of expressing frustration as it arises, in small, manageable amounts, Nicole stores it until the storage capacity is exceeded, and then it all comes out at once. The problem with this cycle is that it's self-reinforcing. Each explosion confirms Nicole's belief that her emotions are dangerous and need to be controlled, which causes her to suppress even harder, which causes the next buildup to be even larger, which causes the next explosion to be even more intense. Without intervention, the cycle tends to escalate over time, with the explosions becoming more frequent and more severe. The show depicts this escalation. Early episodes show Nicole's anger as a comedic exaggeration. Later episodes show it as something that genuinely frightens her family, and sometimes frightens Nicole herself. This isn't just character development. It's an accurate depiction of how untreated emotional suppression progresses over time. If Nicole Watterson is the load-bearing wall of the family, then Richard Watterson is the part of the house that the wall is struggling to hold up. He is, in the most clinical sense possible, the family's identified patient, the member whose visible dysfunction draws attention and concern, even though the dysfunction is actually a property of the entire system. But here's what most casual viewers, and even most fan analyses, get wrong about Richard. They treat him as simple, as a lazy, stupid, food-obsessed man-child who contributes nothing and exists primarily as a comedic foil to Nicole's competence. That reading isn't wrong, exactly, but it's incomplete. Because when you apply real psychological frameworks to Richard's behavior, what you find isn't laziness or stupidity. What you find is something much more specific, much more clinical, and honestly, much sadder. Let's start with an observation that the show itself makes explicitly, multiple times, in multiple ways. Richard does not function as an adult. He does not work. He does not manage money. He cannot be trusted with basic household tasks. He makes decisions based entirely on immediate desires, primarily food and comfort, with no consideration for long-term consequences. His emotional responses are those of a young child. He cries easily, celebrates with physical exuberance, becomes frightened by things that would not frighten a functioning adult, and resolves conflicts through avoidance rather than engagement. A psychologist observing this pattern would not diagnose laziness. Laziness is not a clinical concept. What they would consider is a phenomenon known as developmental arrest, sometimes called developmental stagnation, or in psychodynamic traditions, fixation. Developmental arrest occurs when a person's psychological development stops progressing at a particular stage, usually as a result of trauma, neglect, or an environment that either failed to support further development or actively punished it. The person continues to age physically, but their emotional and cognitive functioning remains characteristic of the stage at which development stalled. In Erik Erikson's model of psychosocial development, one of the most widely used frameworks in developmental psychology, the human lifespan is divided into 8 stages, each characterized by a central conflict that must be resolved for healthy development to continue. The relevant stages for Richard are Stage 4, Industry versus Inferiority, ages 5 to 12. In this stage, children learn to be competent, to complete tasks, develop skills, and experience the satisfaction of mastery. Children who successfully navigate this stage develop a sense of industry, the belief that they can do things, that effort leads to results, that they are capable. Children who fail to navigate this stage develop a sense of inferiority, the belief that they are incapable, that effort is futile, and that competence is something other people have. Stage 5, Identity versus role confusion, ages 12 to 18. In this stage, adolescents develop a coherent sense of who they are, their values, their goals, their place in the world. Successful resolution produces identity, a stable sense of self. Unsuccessful resolution produces role confusion, an inability to commit to a direction, a tendency to drift, a persistent uncertainty about who one is and what one wants. Stage 6, Intimacy versus isolation, young adulthood. In this stage, young adults develop the capacity for genuine emotional intimacy, the ability to share oneself fully with another person without losing oneself in the process. Successful resolution produces intimate relationships. Unsuccessful resolution produces isolation, or, crucially, relationships that mimic intimacy without actually achieving it. Based on the show's depiction, Richard appears to be arrested primarily at stage 4, with significant impairment at stages 5 and 6 as a consequence. He has not developed a sense of industry. He does not believe he is capable of competence, and he does not experience the satisfaction of mastery. He has not developed a stable identity. He has no career, no goals, no values that he can articulate or defend. And his capacity for genuine intimacy is severely limited. His relationship with Nicole, as we'll explore, is characterized more by dependency than by mutual emotional sharing. The question a psychologist would ask is, what happened? What prevented Richard from progressing through these developmental stages? The show provides crucial backstory. Richard's mother, Granny JoJo, is depicted as an intensely overprotective parent. She controlled every aspect of Richard's environment, shielded him from any form of challenge or discomfort, made decisions for him, and communicated, both explicitly and implicitly, that the world was dangerous and that Richard was not equipped to handle it. This parenting style has a specific name in the psychological literature: overprotective parenting, sometimes colloquially called helicopter parenting in its milder forms, or enmeshment in its more severe manifestations. The research on the effects of overprotective parenting is extensive and remarkably consistent. Children raised by overprotective parents tend to develop lower self-efficacy. They don't believe in their own ability to handle challenges. They show higher rates of anxiety and depression. They have difficulty making independent decisions. They struggle with frustration tolerance, the ability to endure discomfort or failure without becoming overwhelmed. And critically, they are at elevated risk for what Martin Seligman famously called learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is one of the most well-documented phenomena in psychology. Seligman's original research, conducted in the 1960s and 70s, demonstrated that when organisms, animals or humans, are repeatedly exposed to situations where their actions have no effect on outcomes, they eventually stop trying. Even when the situation changes and their actions could make a difference, they remain passive. They have learned that effort is futile, and that learning persists even when the evidence changes. Richard Watterson is a textbook case of learned helplessness. His mother taught him, through years of overprotection, that he was not capable of handling the world on his own. Every challenge was removed before he could face it. Every decision was made for him before he could make it. Every failure was prevented before he could learn from it. The result is an adult man who has never developed the fundamental belief that he can affect his own circumstances. Richard doesn't avoid work because he's lazy. He avoids work because, at a deep psychological level, he doesn't believe he can do it. He doesn't make decisions because he doesn't believe his decisions matter. He doesn't take initiative because he has never experienced the connection between his own effort and a positive outcome. This is not a character flaw. It's a developmental injury. Richard was never given the opportunity to develop competence, and the window for developing that foundational sense of I can do things, which, in Erikson's model, primarily opens during childhood and becomes progressively harder to access in adulthood, has largely closed. A psychologist working with Richard would recognize this immediately, and they would also recognize that the treatment is not simple. You cannot tell a person with learned helplessness to just try harder. The helplessness is not a choice. It's a deeply conditioned response that operates below conscious awareness. Treatment typically involves gradual exposure to manageable challenges, starting incredibly small, building evidence of competence one tiny step at a time, and slowly rewiring the belief that effort is futile. The problem is that Richard's current environment, the Watterson household, is not conducive to this treatment, and the reason is Nicole. This is where the individual analyses start connecting into the family system, and it's where the picture gets genuinely uncomfortable. Nicole is hypercompetent. Richard is helpless. These two traits didn't just happen to end up in the same marriage. They are actively reinforcing each other. They exist in a feedback loop that a family therapist would identify as one of the most common and most destructive dynamics in dysfunctional relationships. The dynamic works like this. Richard fails to complete a task or manage a responsibility. Nicole, who cannot tolerate incompletion or disorder, steps in and does it herself. Richard learns, once again, that his efforts aren't necessary. that Nicole will handle it. Nicole learns, once again, that she can't rely on Richard, that she has to do everything herself. Richard's helplessness deepens, Nicole's burden increases, and the cycle repeats. In clinical literature, this is called the overfunctioning-underfunctioning reciprocity, a term derived from Bowen's family systems theory. It describes a dynamic where one partner compensates for the other's deficits, which inadvertently maintains and deepens those deficits. The overfunctioning partner, Nicole, takes on more and more responsibility. She becomes more competent, more controlling, more exhausted. She begins to resent the underfunctioning partner for not contributing, but she also cannot stop overfunctioning because the system has become dependent on her. If she steps back, everything falls apart. She knows this, and that knowledge keeps her trapped. The underfunctioning partner, Richard, contributes less and less. He becomes more passive, more dependent, more childlike. He may want to contribute, and the show occasionally depicts Richard trying to help, but his attempts are typically so incompetent that they create more work for Nicole, which reinforces her belief that she's better off doing everything herself, which reinforces his belief that he can't do anything right. Here's what's crucial to understand. Neither Nicole nor Richard is the villain in this dynamic. They are both trapped. Nicole's overfunctioning is driven by her avoidant attachment style, her deep-seated belief that she can only be safe if she's in control. Richard's underfunctioning is driven by his learned helplessness, his deep-seated belief that he is incapable of contributing. Each partner's psychological wound activates and reinforces the other's. A family therapist would recognize this as one of the most challenging dynamics to treat, precisely because it's so stable. The system works. Not well, not healthily, but it functions. The family survives. The bills get paid. The children are fed. And because it works, there's no acute crisis to motivate change. The dysfunction is chronic, not acute. It's the background radiation of the family, present in every interaction, shaping every relationship, but never quite reaching the threshold that would force a reckoning. This is why the Wattersons never fundamentally change. Not because they're cartoon characters in a show that resets every episode, though that's the mechanical reason, but because the psychological dynamic they're trapped in is, in the real world, extraordinarily resistant to change without external intervention. Couples in this pattern can persist for decades. The overfunctioner burning out in slow motion, the underfunctioner sinking deeper into passivity, both partners increasingly resentful and increasingly unable to articulate why. John Gottman is one of the most influential relationship researchers in the history of psychology. Over decades of research at the University of Washington, he developed the ability to predict, with over 90% accuracy, whether a couple would divorce based on observing just a few minutes of their interaction. Gottman identified 4 communication patterns that are so destructive to relationships that he called them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Criticism is attacking your partner's character rather than addressing specific behavior. Instead of, "I'm frustrated that the dishes aren't done," criticism says, "You never do anything around here. What's wrong with you?" Nicole engages in criticism regularly. Her frustration with Richard frequently crosses the line from addressing specific failures to indicting his fundamental character. This isn't because Nicole is mean. It's because she's exhausted. And the specific failures have accumulated to the point where they feel like character evidence rather than isolated incidents. Contempt is the most destructive of the 4 horsemen. It involves treating your partner with disrespect, mockery, or disgust, communicating that they are beneath you. Eye-rolling, sarcasm, name-calling, and hostile humor are all expressions of contempt. The Watterson marriage shows contempt from both directions, though it manifests differently. Nicole's contempt for Richard's incompetence surfaces in moments of exasperation. The look on her face when he's done something catastrophically stupid, the tone of voice that says, "I can't believe I'm married to this person." Richard's contempt is less visible, but present in his passive resistance, his refusal to change, his cheerful obliviousness to Nicole's suffering, which communicates that her distress doesn't matter enough for him to modify his behavior. Defensiveness is responding to a complaint by deflecting blame, making excuses, or counterattacking. It prevents any complaint from being heard and resolved. Richard is profoundly defensive, though his defensiveness takes a childlike form. When confronted with his failures, he doesn't argue or counterattack. He whines, deflects, plays the victim, or simply ignores the complaint entirely. This is actually more destructive than aggressive defensiveness, because it's nearly impossible to address. There's nothing to push against. The complaint simply vanishes into Richard's passivity. Stonewalling is withdrawing from interaction entirely, shutting down, going silent, or physically leaving. It's the emotional equivalent of building a wall between yourself and your partner. Both Nicole and Richard stonewall, but in different ways. Nicole stonewalls by throwing herself into work, replacing emotional engagement with productive activity. Richard stonewalls by retreating into food, television, or sleep, replacing emotional engagement with physical comfort. In both cases, the effect is the same. The relationship's emotional channel goes dead, and the underlying issues remain unaddressed. Gottman's research suggests that the presence of all four horsemen in a relationship is a strong predictor of relationship failure. The Wattersons display all four consistently across the run of the show. In a real-world context, a Gottman-trained therapist would assess this marriage as being in serious distress, not because the partners don't love each other, but because their communication patterns are systematically preventing them from resolving any of the issues that are causing pain. And yet, the Wattersons stay together. They love each other. This is clear from the show, and it's important to acknowledge. The love is real. But love, in the absence of functional communication and equitable partnership, is not enough to create a healthy relationship. It's enough to sustain a bond, to keep two people connected, but it's not enough to make that connection nourishing rather than depleting. Nicole and Richard's marriage is a perfect illustration of a painful psychological truth. You can love someone deeply and still be in a relationship that is damaging both of you. Before we leave Richard and move to the children, I want to push back against the simplest reading of his character. The reading that says he's just stupid and lazy and there's nothing more to him. The show gives us moments, rare, quiet, easy to miss, where Richard demonstrates qualities that don't fit the man-child archetype. Moments of genuine emotional insight. Moments where he sees something about his family that the more analytical Nicole has missed. Moments where his simplicity functions not as limitation, but as clarity, where his lack of cognitive complexity allows him to perceive emotional truths that more complicated minds overlook. There's a psychological concept here that's relevant. Emotional intelligence is distinct from cognitive intelligence. A person can have limited analytical abilities and still possess significant emotional awareness. Richard's cognitive functioning may be impaired relative to other adults, but his emotional functioning, his ability to feel joy, to express love physically, to be present in the moment, is, in some ways, superior to Nicole's. This is one of the show's most nuanced psychological observations. Richard's simplicity isn't purely a deficit. It's also, paradoxically, a gift. He is capable of a kind of unfiltered emotional presence that Nicole, with all her intelligence and competence, cannot access because her psychological defenses won't allow it. Richard can be fully, unselfconsciously joyful. Nicole can't. Richard can express love without reservation or analysis. Nicole struggles to express love without also expressing the anxiety and control that are fused with it. This doesn't excuse Richard's functional failures. It doesn't make the imbalance in the marriage fair or sustainable. But it does complicate the picture in a way that a good psychologist would insist on acknowledging. Richard is not nothing. He brings something to this family that would be absent without him. And the tragedy of the Wattersons system is that Richard's genuine gifts, his emotional openness, his capacity for joy, his unconditional love, are overshadowed by his functional deficits. And the system has no mechanism for valuing the former while addressing the latter. Now we turn to the children. And we start with Gumball, because Gumball is, in family systems terminology, the identified patient of the sibling subsystem, the child whose behavior most visibly expresses the family's underlying dysfunction. Gumball Watterson is impulsive, attention-seeking, academically poor, socially chaotic, emotionally volatile, and persistently engaged in behavior that creates problems for himself and others. He is, by almost any teacher's assessment, a problem child. He is the kid who gets sent to the principal's office, the kid who other parents complain about, the kid who always seems to be at the center of whatever went wrong today. A surface-level analysis would say that Gumball has behavioral problems. A psychological analysis would say that Gumball is behaving exactly as you would expect a child in his position to behave. Let's start with the family dynamics perspective. Gumball occupies a specific role in the Watterson family system. He is the scapegoat. In family systems theory, the scapegoat is the family member who acts out the family's unresolved tensions through their behavior. They are not the cause of the family's problems. They are the expression of the family's problems. This role is not consciously chosen. It emerges from the family system organically. The scapegoat typically becomes the focus of the family's anxiety and frustration, the person everyone points to when asked, "What's wrong with this family?" And because the scapegoat draws attention away from the deeper, more threatening sources of dysfunction, like marital conflict or parental inadequacy, the system actually has an investment in maintaining the scapegoat's problematic behavior. If Gumball suddenly became a model child, the family would lose its primary outlet for anxiety, and the unresolved tensions between Nicole and Richard would move to the foreground, where they would be much harder to ignore. This is why, in the show, Gumball's behavior never fundamentally changes, despite constant negative consequences. It's not that he can't learn, it's that the system needs him to be the problem. Every time Nicole's frustration lands on Gumball rather than on Richard, every time the family's energy goes into managing Gumball's latest crisis rather than addressing the marital dysfunction, the system is using Gumball as a pressure valve. A child therapist working with Gumball in isolation, without addressing the family system, would find treatment frustrating and largely ineffective. Because Gumball's behavior isn't really about Gumball, it's about the family. And until the family changes, the behavior will persist, no matter how many consequences are applied or how many social skills are taught. If Nicole's attachment style is avoidant, Gumball's attachment style is its mirror image: anxious, preoccupied. Children with anxious attachment have caregivers who are inconsistent, sometimes warm and available, sometimes cold or frightening, and the child cannot predict which version of the caregiver will appear. The child adapts by becoming hypervigilant about the caregiver's emotional state, constantly scanning for signs of approval or disapproval, and developing an intense need for reassurance and attention. This maps precisely onto Gumball's experience with Nicole. Nicole loves Gumball. This is not in question, but her expression of love is inconsistent, filtered through her own psychological struggles, her exhaustion, and the build-up-release cycle we discussed earlier. Sometimes Nicole is warm, affectionate, and supportive. Sometimes she is irritable, critical, and frightening. Gumball cannot predict which Nicole he will encounter at any given moment, and this unpredictability has shaped his attachment style in exactly the way the research predicts. Gumball's attention-seeking behavior, his need for validation, his constant performance, his inability to tolerate being ignored, these are all hallmarks of anxious attachment. He is not behaving badly because he wants to cause trouble. He is behaving badly because negative attention is still attention, and for an anxiously attached child, any form of engagement with the attachment figure is preferable to being ignored. This is a critical insight that changes how we understand virtually every Gumball episode. When Gumball does something reckless, attention-grabbing, or self-defeating, he is not being random or stupid. He is executing a strategy, an unconscious strategy, developed in response to the specific emotional environment of his family, designed to ensure that the people he depends on are paying attention to him. The quality of the attention doesn't matter. What matters is its presence. A therapist would see Gumball's behavior and immediately look at the attachment relationship with the primary caregiver. And they would find exactly what we've described. A caregiver whose emotional availability fluctuates unpredictably due to her own unresolved psychological issues. The treatment for Gumball would necessarily involve treatment for Nicole, specifically helping Nicole develop more consistent emotional availability and helping Gumball develop the internal security that his attachment history has failed to provide. We've examined the parents. We've mapped the system. We've seen how Nicole and Richard's individual psychologies interlock to create a self-reinforcing cycle of overfunctioning and underfunctioning that neither can escape. And we've begun to see how that cycle shapes the children, starting with Gumball, the family's scapegoat, whose anxious attachment and attention-seeking behavior are direct responses to the emotional environment his parents have created. Now we turn to the other two children, and what we find with Darwin and Aeneas is, in many ways, even more psychologically rich than what we found with Gumball. Because while Gumball's dysfunction is visible, loud, chaotic, impossible to ignore, Darwin and Aeneas have developed coping strategies that are quieter, more sophisticated, and far easier to mistake for health. A good psychologist knows that the loudest person in the family is rarely the one carrying the deepest wound. The deepest wounds belong to the ones who learn to be quiet about them. Let's start with Darwin. Darwin's origin story is, even by the standards of a cartoon, unusual. He was a pet goldfish who grew legs, developed the ability to breathe air and speak, and was adopted into the Watterson family as a full member. The show treats this as a given. It's the premise, and the characters accept it without question. But if we take Darwin's situation seriously, as we've been doing with every other character, his psychological profile becomes one of the most complex and most poignant in the entire show. Darwin is, fundamentally, an adopted child. Regardless of the fantastical circumstances, the psychological reality is that Darwin was born into one context, a fishbowl, a fundamentally different existence, and was integrated into a family to which he has no biological connection. He looks different from every other family member. His origins are different. His nature is different. And yet he has been accepted, loved, and treated as a full member of the family. This is, on the surface, a beautiful story, and the show treats it as such. But the psychology of adoption, even successful, loving adoption, is more complex than the happy ending suggests. Research on adopted children, summarized extensively in the work of David Brodzinski and others, has identified several psychological themes that are common across adopted individuals, regardless of the quality of the adoptive family. These include identity confusion related to belonging to two families, the biological and the adoptive. They include a heightened sensitivity to rejection and abandonment, rooted in the primal experience of separation from the original context. They include what Brodzinski calls adoptive identity work, the ongoing psychological process of integrating the fact of one's adoption into a coherent sense of self. And they include, critically for understanding Darwin, a tendency toward compliance and people-pleasing as a strategy for securing one's place in the adoptive family. This last point is the key to understanding Darwin's entire psychology. Darwin is, without question, the most agreeable character in the amazing world of Gumball. He is supportive, loyal, empathetic, accommodating, and almost pathologically conflict-averse. He goes along with Gumball's schemes even when he knows they're bad ideas. He defers to other people's preferences. He apologizes quickly and thoroughly. He works hard to maintain harmony in every relationship. Most viewers see this as Darwin simply being a nice person, and he is a nice person. But the intensity and consistency of his agreeableness, the degree to which he will subordinate his own needs, preferences, and judgment to maintain relational harmony, goes beyond ordinary niceness. It enters the territory of what psychologists call fawning, a trauma response characterized by compulsive people-pleasing as a strategy for maintaining safety. The concept of fawning was developed by psychotherapist Pete Walker as an extension of the traditional fight-flight-freeze model of trauma responses. Walker observed that some individuals, particularly those who experienced relational trauma in childhood, including the trauma of early separation or unstable attachment, develop a fourth response: fawning. Instead of fighting the threat, fleeing from it, or freezing in response to it, they appease it. They become whatever the threatening person needs them to be. They suppress their own identity in service of maintaining the relationship. This is Darwin's primary mode of operating. He does not fight. He rarely flees. He does not freeze. He fawns. He becomes what the situation requires. When Gumball needs a loyal sidekick, Darwin is a loyal sidekick. When Nicole needs a compliant child, Darwin is a compliant child. When Richard needs a playmate, Darwin is a playmate. When Aeneas needs an ally, Darwin is an ally. The question a psychologist would ask is, who is Darwin when nobody needs him to be anything? And the answer, based on the show's evidence, is troubling. We don't know. Darwin without a role to play, without a person to accommodate, without a relationship to maintain, is a character the show rarely depicts. And when it does, in the rare moments where Darwin is alone with his own thoughts, what emerges is not the cheerful, agreeable fish we're used to seeing. What emerges is anxiety, uncertainty, a deep, wordless fear that without his usefulness, without his agreeableness, he has no place. This is the core wound of the adopted child who has learned to fawn. The belief that love is conditional on performance. Not the performance of competence, as in Nicole's case, but the performance of accommodation. Darwin believes, unconsciously, automatically, below the level of articulation, that his place in the Watterson family is contingent on his continued willingness to be easy, to not cause problems, to not have needs that inconvenience others, to be, in every moment, the family member who requires the least and gives the most. This belief is not based on anything the Wattersons have done. Nicole, Richard, and even Gumball love Darwin genuinely and would not abandon him. But the belief doesn't come from this family. It comes from the primal experience of being separated from one's original context, the fishbowl, the biological origin, whatever Darwin's existence was before the Wattersons. That separation, regardless of what came after, planted a seed of insecurity that Darwin's fawning behavior has been managing ever since. In the clinical literature, this pattern is associated with what attachment researchers call anxious, preoccupied attachment, the same category as Gumball, but expressed through a completely different behavioral strategy. Where Gumball's anxious attachment manifests as loud, disruptive attention-seeking, Darwin's manifests as quiet, relentless accommodation. Both strategies serve the same underlying purpose, ensuring that the attachment figure remains engaged and available. They're just using opposite methods to achieve it. The relationship between Darwin and Gumball is one of the most prominent dynamics in the show, and it deserves clinical attention because it displays several features of what psychologists call codependency. Codependency, as defined by researchers like Melody Beattie and further explored in clinical settings, is a relational pattern in which one person's sense of identity and self-worth becomes excessively dependent on their relationship with another person. The codependent individual organizes their life around the other person's needs, moods, and behavior, often at the expense of their own well-being. Darwin's relationship with Gumball shows multiple markers of codependency. Darwin prioritizes Gumball's needs over his own consistently and automatically. He tolerates behavior from Gumball that is objectively inconsiderate, being dragged into dangerous situations, being ignored when inconvenient, being overridden in decisions, without sustained objection. His emotional state is closely tied to Gumball's emotional state. When Gumball is happy, Darwin is happy. When Gumball is distressed, Darwin is distressed. Darwin's independent emotional regulation, his ability to feel okay regardless of how Gumball is feeling, is significantly impaired. This isn't friendship. This is enmeshment, a concept from Salvador Minuchin's structural family therapy that describes a relationship where the boundaries between two individuals have become so blurred that they function as a single unit rather than as two separate selves. The show occasionally explores what happens when this enmeshment is threatened, when Darwin and Gumball are separated, or when one of them forms a connection that excludes the other. These episodes typically depict intense anxiety, jealousy, and destabilization in both characters, but especially in Darwin. His reaction to potential separation from Gumball isn't just sadness, it's existential panic. As if without Gumball, Darwin ceases to exist in a meaningful way. This is clinically significant because it suggests that Darwin has not achieved what psychologists call individuation, the developmental process by which a person establishes a sense of self that is distinct from their relationships. Darwin's identity is almost entirely relational. He is Gumball's brother. He is the Wattersons' adopted son. He is the nice one. He is the helpful one. Strip away these roles, and there is very little self remaining. A therapist working with Darwin would focus on helping him develop an independent sense of identity, interests, values, preferences, and boundaries that exist regardless of what other people need from him. This would necessarily involve tolerating the discomfort of not being accommodating, which, for someone whose entire psychological survival strategy is built on accommodation, would feel genuinely threatening. It would feel like risking everything, and that's exactly why it would be the most important work Darwin could do. Anais is 4 years old. She is the youngest member of the Watterson family by a significant margin. She is also, by virtually every measure the show provides, the most intelligent person in the household. She reads at an advanced level. She solves problems that stump the other characters. She sees through deceptions and manipulations that fool everyone around her. She is, in the language of educational psychology, profoundly gifted. Most viewers see Anais as the family's voice of reason, the smart one who provides a counterpoint to the chaos around her. And she is that. But what a psychologist would see, underneath the intelligence and the competence, is a child carrying a burden that no 4-year-old should carry. That burden has a name. It's called parentification. Parentification is a concept developed by family therapist Ivan Bosormeny-Nagy in the 1970s. It describes a role reversal in which a child takes on responsibilities, emotional or practical, that are normally the domain of adults. The parentified child becomes the caretaker, the mediator, the problem solver, the voice of reason. They manage the family's emotions. They step in when the adults can't or won't. They sacrifice their own developmental needs in service of the family's functioning. There are 2 types of parentification. Instrumental parentification involves the child taking on practical tasks: cooking, cleaning, managing siblings, paying bills. Emotional parentification involves the child taking on emotional tasks, mediating conflicts, providing comfort to parents, managing the family's mood, absorbing anxiety. Anais displays both types, but emotional parentification is her primary burden. She is the one who sees the family dynamic clearly. She is the one who understands why Nicole is stressed, why Richard is incapable, why Gumball is acting out, why Darwin is accommodating. She holds an awareness of the system that nobody else in the family possesses. And because she holds that awareness, she feels responsible for managing it. This is an enormous amount of cognitive and emotional work for anyone. For a 4-year-old, it's staggering. The research on parentification, summarized by researchers like Gregory Yurkovich in his work on destructive parentification, identifies several consistent long-term consequences. Parentified children tend to develop what appears to be unusual maturity and competence. They seem wise beyond their years, capable, and self-possessed. But this appearance masks significant developmental costs. Parentified children often struggle to access their own needs because they've spent so long attending to everyone else's. They develop a pattern of hyper-responsibility, the belief that if something goes wrong, it's their fault for not preventing it. They have difficulty being playful, spontaneous, or carefree because their psychological resources are consumed by the work of monitoring and managing the family system. And they are at elevated risk for depression and anxiety in adolescence and adulthood because the weight they've been carrying eventually exceeds their capacity. Anais shows early signs of several of these patterns. Her maturity, while impressive, is not age-appropriate. It's a compensatory adaptation to an environment that doesn't provide the adult oversight a child her age needs. Her seriousness, her analytical approach to problems, her tendency to view the world in terms of systems and solutions rather than in terms of play and imagination. These are not simply personality traits. They are the markers of a child who has had to grow up too fast because the adults in her life left a gap that needed to be filled. Anais's giftedness adds an additional layer of complexity to her parentification. Research by Kazimierz Dabrowski, a Polish psychiatrist and psychologist, introduced the concept of overexcitabilities, a heightened sensitivity to stimuli that is common in gifted individuals. Dabrowski identified 5 forms of overexcitability: psychomotor, sensual, imaginational, intellectual, and emotional. Emotional overexcitability, an intensified capacity to feel and process emotions, is particularly relevant to Anais. Gifted children with emotional overexcitability don't just think more than other children. They feel more. They experience empathy more intensely. They are more aware of suffering, their own and others. They have a heightened sense of justice and fairness, and they are acutely sensitive to the emotional undercurrents in their environment. For a child like Anais, living in the Watterson household means being constantly exposed to emotional dynamics that she can perceive and understand but cannot control. She can see that her mother is burning out. She can see that her father is helpless. She can see that her brother is acting out because he's anxious. She can see that Darwin is accommodating because he's afraid of losing his place. She can see all of it, and she cannot fix any of it. This combination, the ability to perceive problems clearly and the inability to solve them, is psychologically agonizing, particularly for a gifted child. It creates a specific form of distress that researchers call existential depression. Depression that arises not from personal loss or failure, but from an awareness of problems that feel too large, too entrenched, and too systemic to address. Anais is 4. She is experiencing, in a form that she may not be able to articulate, the existential weight of understanding a dysfunctional family system that she is powerless to change. She copes by intellectualizing, by treating the family's problems as puzzles to be solved rather than emotions to be felt. This is an effective short-term strategy, but intellectualization is a defense mechanism, not a solution. It manages the pain without addressing it, and over time, the pain accumulates. A psychologist working with Anais would need to help her access the emotions underneath her intellectual defenses: the fear, the sadness, the anger, the loneliness that come with being the smartest person in a struggling family. They would also need to explicitly release her from the responsibility she's taken on. Anais needs to hear from a competent adult, in a way she can believe, that the family's problems are not hers to solve, that she is allowed to be 4, that she is allowed to not know the answer, that she is allowed to play. Whether she would believe it is another question. Because the family system, as it currently operates, needs Aeneas in her parentified role almost as much as it needs Gumball in his scapegoat role. Without Aeneas providing the emotional intelligence and practical problem solving that the adults cannot reliably provide, the system's functioning degrades further. The system has an investment in keeping Aeneas burdened, even though no individual family member would consciously choose to burden her. This is the cruelty of family systems dysfunction. It's nobody's fault and everybody's problem. The system perpetuates itself through the very people who are suffering from it. Now that we've examined each child individually, let's look at them as a unit, the sibling subsystem in Minuchin's terminology. Because the way these three children relate to each other reveals the family system's dynamics in miniature. Gumball is the scapegoat. His strategy is to be loud, to draw attention, to create chaos, to ensure that the family's focus stays on him, even if that focus is negative. His role in the sibling subsystem is to be the axis around which things happen. Darwin is the accommodator. His strategy is to be easy, to support, to agree, to smooth over conflicts, to make himself indispensable through agreeableness. His role in the sibling subsystem is to be the stabilizer, the one who absorbs friction and converts it into harmony. Aeneas is the parentified child. Her strategy is to be competent, to see clearly, to solve problems, to be the adult when the actual adults fail. Her role in the sibling subsystem is to be the safety net, the one who catches things that everyone else misses. Together, these three strategies form a complete compensatory system. Between them, the Watterson children have distributed the functions that their parents are failing to provide. Gumball provides the emotional expression that Nicole suppresses and Richard can't regulate. Darwin provides the relational warmth and responsiveness that the marital dysfunction has depleted. Aeneas provides the rational oversight and problem solving that both parents, in different ways, are unable to sustain. The children, without knowing it, have built a parallel family structure, one that fills the gaps in the adult family structure. This is adaptive. It's what children do in dysfunctional households. They find ways to get their needs met, even when the official caregiving structure can't or won't meet those needs. But it's also costly. Every function a child takes on is a function they shouldn't have to perform. Every gap they fill is a gap that should have been filled by an adult. And every moment they spend compensating for their parents' limitations is a moment they're not spending on the developmental tasks that belong to childhood: play, exploration, identity formation, the gradual and supported development of autonomy. The Watterson children are surviving. They are even, in many ways, thriving. But they are doing so at a cost that won't become fully apparent until they're older, until the developmental deficits that their compensatory roles created begin to manifest as adult struggles with relationships, identity, and emotional regulation. One more observation about the sibling subsystem before we move on. In healthy families, children's roles are fluid. A child might be the responsible one today and the playful one tomorrow. They might lead in one context and follow in another. Flexibility of role is a sign of a healthy family system. It means the system doesn't need any particular child to perform any particular function. In the Watterson household, the children's roles are rigid. Gumball is always the chaotic one. Darwin is always the accommodating one. Aeneas is always the smart one. These roles are so fixed that the characters themselves seem to feel trapped in them. There are episodes where each child tries to step outside their role, and the system pushes back. Gumball tries to be responsible, and something goes wrong that pulls him back into chaos. Darwin tries to assert himself, and the discomfort is so intense that he retreats back into accommodation. Aeneas tries to be silly and carefree, and the family's need for her competence pulls her back into the parental role. This role rigidity is both a symptom and a cause of the family's dysfunction. It's a symptom because it reflects the system's need for each child to perform a specific compensatory function. And it's a cause because it prevents the children from developing the psychological flexibility that healthy development requires. A child who can only be one thing, who is locked into a single role by the system's needs, is a child whose development is being constrained. Family therapists working with the Wattersons would likely focus significant attention on disrupting this role rigidity, creating space for Gumball to be calm without feeling invisible, for Darwin to have boundaries without feeling rejected, and for Aeneas to be a child without feeling irresponsible. This work would be met with resistance, not from the children, but from the system itself, because the system has organized itself around these roles, and any change threatens its stability. But stability that requires children to sacrifice their development is not stability worth preserving. It's stagnation disguised as balance. Up until now, we've been looking at the Wattersons as a psychologist would look at patients, examining their behaviors, mapping their dynamics, identifying the patterns that clinical frameworks predict, and the show confirms. We've treated the characters as people. Now we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to look at the show itself, specific episodes, specific moments, specific creative choices, and examine how the amazing world of Gumball depicts psychological phenomena. Because what makes this show remarkable isn't just that its characters have realistic psychology, it's that the show itself seems to understand psychology at a level that goes far beyond what a children's cartoon is expected to achieve. Some of what follows may have been intentional on the part of the show's creators. Some of it may have emerged organically from good writing and careful observation of human behavior. The distinction doesn't matter. What matters is that the show gets it right again and again in ways that are clinically precise and emotionally devastating. Let's start with the episode that, from a psychological perspective, might be the most important one the show ever produced. The Choices, from Season 4, is an episode that depicts Nicole imagining alternate versions of her life. What would have happened if she had made different decisions at key moments? What if she hadn't gone to the Rainbow Factory? What if she hadn't married Richard? What if she had pursued her own ambitions instead of building her life around her family? On the surface, this is a what-if episode, a common storytelling device. But the psychological content of this episode is remarkably sophisticated because it engages directly with one of the most studied phenomena in clinical psychology, counterfactual thinking and its relationship to regret. Counterfactual thinking is the cognitive process of imagining alternatives to events that have already occurred. What if I had taken that job? What if I hadn't married that person? What if I had said yes instead of no? Every human engages in counterfactual thinking. It's a normal part of cognitive processing. But when counterfactual thinking becomes chronic, when a person spends significant time and emotional energy imagining lives they didn't live, it becomes a source of profound psychological distress. Research by Neil Rose and others has identified two types of counterfactual thinking. Upward counterfactuals imagine better alternatives. My life would have been better if I had done X. Downward counterfactuals imagine worse alternatives. My life could have been worse if I hadn't done Y. Upward counterfactuals tend to produce regret and dissatisfaction. Downward counterfactuals tend to produce gratitude and relief. What's remarkable about The Choices is that it depicts Nicole engaging in both types, and the episode is honest about the emotional consequences of each. Nicole imagines lives where she's more successful, more fulfilled, more free. These visions produce genuine pain, a recognition of what she sacrificed. But she also sees, in the life she actually chose, moments of genuine love and connection that the alternate lives don't contain. The episode doesn't pretend that Nicole's choice was easy or that she has no reason for regret. It simply places the regret alongside the love and asks the viewer and Nicole to hold both at the same time. This is exactly what a good therapist would do. The goal of therapy isn't to eliminate regret. It's to help the client integrate regret into a life that also contains meaning, connection, and purpose. To hold the pain of the path not taken alongside the value of the path chosen, without letting either one negate the other. The Choices does this in 20 minutes with more emotional precision than many therapy sessions achieve in an hour. And it does it through a cartoon about a blue cat. The Shell, from Season 3, is the episode where Penny Fitzgerald finally breaks out of her shell. Literally. Penny, who has spent the entire series encased in a peanut-shaped shell, cracks open and reveals her true form underneath. Her true form is unstable. It shifts and changes based on her emotions, becoming beautiful when she feels confident and monstrous when she feels afraid. This is one of the most psychologically literate pieces of children's animation ever produced. The Shell is a perfect visual metaphor for what psychologists call the false self, a concept developed by Donald Winnicott in the 1960s. Winnicott observed that children who grow up in environments where their authentic selves are not accepted develop a false self, a constructed persona that is designed to meet the expectations of others. The false self is protective. It shields the true self from rejection, but it also imprisons the true self, preventing genuine connection and authentic expression. Penny's shell is her false self. It's what she presents to the world. It's stable, predictable, and socially acceptable. But it's not her. The real Penny, the one underneath the shell, is volatile, shape-shifting, and deeply vulnerable. She changes form based on her emotional state because her authentic self has never been given a stable environment in which to develop. She literally doesn't have a fixed shape because she's never been allowed to discover who she really is. The episode's central conflict, Penny's fear that her true form will be rejected, is a precise depiction of the core fear that drives the false self. Winnicott understood that the false self isn't maintained out of vanity or deception. It's maintained out of terror. The person beneath the mask believes, at a fundamental level, that their true self is unacceptable. That if people saw who they really were, they would be abandoned. Penny's father, who is horrified by her shell breaking and tries to force her back inside it, represents the environmental pressure that created the false self in the first place. He doesn't want to see the real Penny because the real Penny is unpredictable, emotional, and difficult to control. The shell, the false self, is manageable. It's contained. It's what he's comfortable with. And Gumball's response, his insistence that Penny is beautiful in every form, that he loves the real her regardless of what shape she takes, is a depiction of what Winnicott would call a facilitating environment, a relationship that is safe enough for the true self to emerge. Gumball doesn't try to fix Penny or stabilize her. He simply accepts her as she is, in all her instability and vulnerability. And that acceptance, that unconditional positive regard, to use Carl Rogers' term, is what allows Penny to begin the terrifying process of being real. The episode even gets the emotional aftermath right. Penny doesn't break out of her shell and immediately become confident and stable. She's frightened. She's overwhelmed. She literally runs away. Because emerging from the false self isn't a moment of liberation. It's a moment of exposure. It's the most vulnerable you've ever been. And the initial response to that vulnerability is almost always panic. A therapist watching The Shell would recognize virtually every beat of this episode as clinically accurate. The false self, the terror of exposure, the parental pressure to conform, the healing power of unconditional acceptance, the panic that follows vulnerability. It's all there. It's all correct. And it's all rendered in a way that children can intuitively understand even if they've never heard of Winnicott or Rogers or the false self. The Burden, from Season 5, sends Gumball and Darwin on an adventure where they have to care for the school's elderly tortoise, and the experience gives them a glimpse of what it feels like to carry responsibility that never ends. But there are other episodes throughout the series that more directly address the experience of depression, and they do so with startling accuracy. Throughout the show, there are moments where characters, particularly Nicole and Gumball, experience what can only be described as depressive episodes. The show renders these moments visually. Colors desaturate. Movement slows. The character becomes isolated within the frame. The world continues to move around them, but they're no longer part of it. They're watching from inside a bubble of disconnection. This visual approach to depicting depression is more accurate than most live-action representations. Depression doesn't look like crying. It doesn't look like dramatic despair. It looks like disconnection. It looks like the world continuing to move while you stand still. It looks like the colors draining out of things that used to have color. It looks like being present in a room and absent from it simultaneously. The psychological term for this experience is anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure from activities that normally produce it. Anhedonia is one of the two core symptoms of major depressive disorder in the DSM-5, the other being persistent depressed mood. It's the symptom that people who haven't experienced depression find hardest to understand, because it's not sadness. It's the absence of feeling. It's the flatness that replaces engagement. It's exactly what the show depicts when the colors drain away and the character stands motionless while the world continues without them. The show also accurately depicts the social dimension of depression, the way depressed individuals withdraw from relationships not because they want to be alone, but because they no longer feel capable of performing the emotional labor that connection requires. When Nicole retreats into mechanical functioning, going through the motions of her day without genuine engagement, she's demonstrating a depressive pattern that psychologists call behavioral activation deficit. She's doing things, but she's not experiencing them. The behavior continues on autopilot, while the subjective experience of meaning has gone offline. What's particularly impressive about the show's depiction of depression is that it doesn't romanticize it. It doesn't present depression as deep or meaningful or artistically productive. It presents it as flat, empty, and isolating, which is exactly what it is. And by embedding these moments inside a comedy, inside a show that is otherwise vibrant, colorful, and fast-paced, the show creates a contrast that makes the depressive episodes even more impactful. You feel the absence of color because you've been surrounded by color. You feel the stillness because you've been surrounded by motion. The Amazing World of Gumball has several episodes that deal with the concept of disappearing, of becoming invisible, forgotten, or literally non-existent. These episodes, while entertaining on their surface, engage with a psychological phenomenon that is far more common and far more distressing than most people realize: dissociation. Dissociation, as defined in the DSM-5, is a disruption in the normally integrated functions of consciousness, memory, identity, or perception. In its mild forms, dissociation is the experience of spacing out, losing track of time, feeling detached from your surroundings, experiencing yourself as if from outside your own body. In its severe forms, dissociation can involve complete loss of identity, fragmented memory, and the experience of the world as unreal. The show's depiction of characters who fade, who are forgotten, who literally cease to exist when nobody is paying attention to them, is a remarkably apt visual metaphor for dissociative experience. The feeling that you are disappearing, that without external validation, you have no substance, is one of the most common descriptions that dissociative patients provide. The Nobody from Season 4 explicitly explores this concept through a character who has become so invisible, so forgotten, so absent from the awareness of others, that he has literally faded from existence. He is still physically present, but nobody can see him. Nobody remembers him. He exists in the gaps between other people's attention. From a psychological perspective, this is a precise depiction of what relational theorists call the experience of non-existence, the feeling that one's self exists only in relation to others, and that without those relationships, the self dissolves. This experience is most commonly associated with severe attachment disruption, borderline personality dynamics, and early childhood neglect. Conditions where the developing self never received enough consistent mirroring from caregivers to develop a stable sense of internal existence. The episode's resolution, in which the forgotten character is seen and acknowledged by Gumball and Darwin, and through being seen, becomes real again, is a perfect illustration of the therapeutic principle that the self is constituted in relationship. We become real through being witnessed. We develop a sense of our own existence through the experience of mattering to someone else. Without that experience, the self remains unformed, insubstantial, and vulnerable to dissolution. This is psychology rendered as animation, and it works. The show frequently returns to the theme of identity. Who are you really, underneath the roles you play and the expectations you perform? Several episodes deal with this explicitly, and they demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of how identity formation works in a social context. The concept at play here is what sociologist Irving Goffman called impression management, the process by which individuals control how they are perceived by others. Goffman argued that social life is fundamentally a performance. We present different versions of ourselves to different audiences, adjusting our behavior, speech, and self-presentation to meet the expectations of each social context. The Watterson children are all engaged in impression management to varying degrees. Gumball performs the role of the confident class clown, even though his underlying emotional state is anxious and insecure. Darwin performs the role of the perfect friend and agreeable companion, even though his underlying emotional state is fearful and compliant. Anais performs the role of the competent genius, even though her underlying emotional state is burdened and lonely. The show interrogates these performances in episodes where the characters' public personas are challenged or stripped away. When Gumball's confidence is undermined and the class clown mask drops, what's underneath is a deeply insecure child who is terrified of being unremarkable. When Darwin's agreeableness is pushed to its limit and the nice guy mask drops, what's underneath is resentment and a hunger for autonomy. When Anais's competence is shown to be insufficient and the genius mask drops, what's underneath is a small child who is exhausted by the weight of being the responsible one. These moments of unmasking are psychologically precious because they reveal the gap between the performed self and the experienced self, between who the characters appear to be and who they actually are. And the show treats these moments with remarkable sensitivity. It doesn't mock the characters for having masks. It doesn't punish them for the gap between appearance and reality. It simply reveals the gap, lets the audience see what's underneath, and then, because this is still a comedy, allows the masks to reassemble. But the audience has seen, and once you've seen underneath the mask never looks quite the same again. Before we move to our final section, we need to talk about the environment in which all of this takes place. Because Elmore is not a neutral backdrop. It's an active participant in the psychological dynamics we've been analyzing. Environmental psychology, the study of how physical and social environments affect human behavior and well-being, offers several relevant frameworks for understanding Elmore. The first is the concept of environmental unpredictability. Research by psychologists like Vladas Griskevicius and others has demonstrated that growing up in an unpredictable environment, one where circumstances change rapidly and without warning, has measurable effects on cognitive development, risk-taking behavior, and emotional regulation. Children in unpredictable environments tend to develop faster behavioral strategies. They mature earlier in some ways, take more risks, and prioritize short-term rewards over long-term planning. Elmore is, by any measure, an extraordinarily unpredictable environment. The rules of physics are inconsistent. The social landscape shifts constantly. Bizarre, threatening, and reality-altering events occur with no warning and no lasting consequence. For the Watterson children, growing up in Elmore means growing up in a world where you cannot rely on anything being the same from one day to the next. This environmental unpredictability interacts with the family dysfunction we've already described to create a doubly destabilizing experience. The children can't rely on their family to be consistent, and they can't rely on their world to be consistent. The result is a pervasive sense of insecurity that underlies everything, a feeling that the ground could shift at any moment, that safety is always temporary, and that the only reliable resource is oneself. The second relevant concept is what psychologist Yuri Bronfenbrenner called the ecological systems model, a framework that describes human development as occurring within nested layers of environmental influence. The innermost layer, the microsystem, includes the immediate family and school. The next layer, the mesosystem, includes the interactions between microsystem elements, how the family relates to the school, how the school relates to the community. Beyond that are the exosystem, broader social structures that indirectly affect the child, and the macrosystem, cultural values and ideologies. For the Watterson children, every level of this ecological model is compromised. The microsystem, the family, is dysfunctional in the ways we've described. The school, represented primarily by Miss Simeon and Principal Brown, provides neither effective education nor emotional support. The mesosystem, the interaction between family and school, is characterized by mutual dysfunction, with Nicole's interventions at the school being driven more by her own anxiety than by the children's actual needs, and the school's interactions with the family being characterized by blame and incompetence. The exosystem, Elmore's broader social structures, offers no safety net. There are no competent authorities. There is no reliable governance. There are no social services, no mental health resources, no institutional structures that might catch what the family drops. The children exist in a social environment that is as chaotic and unreliable as their home environment. And the macro system, the cultural values of Elmore, seems to normalize dysfunction. The bizarre events, the constant property destruction, the emotional volatility of virtually every resident. All of this is treated as ordinary. Nobody in Elmore seems to think that the level of chaos they live in is unusual. The dysfunction has been normalized to the point of invisibility. This is, psychologically speaking, the most insidious form of dysfunction, the kind that everyone agrees to pretend is normal. Because when dysfunction is normalized, the people suffering from it lose the ability to recognize their own suffering. They have no reference point for what healthy looks like. They assume that their experience is universal, that everyone lives like this, that every family works like this, that every town is like this. The Watterson children have never known anything different, and that, more than any individual diagnosis or family dynamic, may be the most concerning thing a psychologist would observe. Not that the children are suffering, but that they don't know they're suffering, because to them, this is just life. We're approaching the final stretch now. We've examined the individuals. We've mapped the system. We've seen how the show depicts psychological phenomena with clinical precision, and we've looked at the environment that contains it all. One section remains, and it's the one that brings everything together, the one that asks the question a psychologist would ask at the end of a comprehensive assessment. Given everything we've observed, what's the prognosis? What does the future hold for this family? And is there hope? The answer, as with most things in psychology, is complicated, but it's worth exploring, because the Wattersons, for all their dysfunction, have something that many real families in their situation do not. And that something might be the difference between a family that collapses and a family that, against all odds, endures. Let the words settle. We're almost at the end now. We've spent hours in the Watterson household now. We've sat with Nicole's rage and exhaustion. We've examined Richard's helplessness and its origins. We've watched Gumball perform for attention he can't secure, Darwin accommodate to earn belonging he already has, and Aeneas carry a burden that no 4-year-old should know exists. We've mapped the system, the over-functioning, under-functioning loop between the parents, the triangulation of the children, the rigid roles that each family member occupies, the environmental chaos that surrounds and compounds everything. And if we stopped here, the picture would be bleak. A family in chronic distress, trapped in patterns that reinforce themselves. living in an environment that normalizes dysfunction and offers no external support. But we're not going to stop here, because a competent psychologist doesn't just diagnose. They also assess resilience. They look for strengths. They identify the factors that might provide a foundation for growth, even in a system as compromised as this one. And the Wattersons, despite everything we've discussed, have resilience factors that are genuinely remarkable. Not because they erase the dysfunction. They don't. But because they create the possibility, the slim, fragile, precious possibility, that this family could get better. Let's talk about what's actually right with the Wattersons. This is the most important thing a psychologist would observe about the Watterson family, and it needs to be stated clearly. The love in this family is genuine. This might sound obvious. Of course they love each other. It's a family show. But from a clinical perspective, the presence of genuine attachment in a dysfunctional family is not a given. There are families where the dysfunction has eroded the emotional bonds to the point where the members are connected by obligation, habit, or dependency, but not by authentic emotional investment. The members of these families may go through the motions of closeness, but the underlying affective bond, the actual feeling of mattering to each other, has been depleted. The Wattersons are not that family. Despite everything, despite Nicole's rage and exhaustion, despite Richard's incompetence, despite the chaos and the conflict and the constant crises, there is a bedrock of genuine emotional connection in this household that has never been fully eroded. Nicole loves her children with a ferocity that goes beyond duty. Her rage, as we discussed, is a secondary emotion, and the primary emotions beneath it are almost always fear for her family's safety and grief over her inability to give them the life she wants them to have. She doesn't explode because she doesn't care. She explodes because she cares so much that the weight of it exceeds her capacity to hold it gracefully. Richard loves his family with an uncomplicated warmth that, for all his deficits, is one of the most psychologically healthy things in the household. His love isn't performance. It isn't contingent on behavior or achievement. It's simple, present, and unconditional. Richard doesn't love his children because they're good, or smart, or successful. He loves them because they exist. And that kind of love, the kind that doesn't need to be earned, is exactly what attachment theory says children need most. Gumball and Darwin's bond, for all its codependent qualities, is also rooted in genuine mutual care. They don't just need each other, they enjoy each other. They share joy. They create together. They comfort each other in distress. The enmeshment is a problem, yes, but the love underneath the enmeshment is real, and real love is the foundation on which healthier patterns can eventually be built. Even Aeneas, for all her parentification and her intellectual defenses, is clearly and deeply connected to her family. Her burden comes from love, from caring so much about these people that she can't stop trying to hold them together. A parentified child who has given up on the family, who performs the caretaking role mechanically without emotional investment, is in a much worse clinical position than a parentified child who is still emotionally engaged. Aeneas is still engaged. She's still trying. That engagement, even though it's currently expressing itself in an unhealthy way, is a resource that therapy could redirect. In the attachment literature, the presence of at least one secure emotional bond is the single strongest predictor of resilience in children from dysfunctional families. The bond doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be with a parent. It just has to be real. A relationship in which the child feels genuinely seen, valued, and safe. The Watterson children have multiple such bonds. They have each other. They have moments of genuine security with Nicole. They have Richard's unconditional warmth. These bonds don't cancel out the dysfunction, but they provide a psychological foundation that the dysfunction has not destroyed. And that foundation is everything. Here's something that a psychologist would note about the Watterson household that distinguishes it from many dysfunctional families. Emotions are expressed. This might seem like a strange thing to cite as a strength, given that we've spent considerable time discussing the problems with how emotions are expressed in this family. Nicole's rage, Gumball's acting out, Richard's childlike reactivity. These are all maladaptive forms of emotional expression. They cause damage. They create fear. They prevent resolution. But they are still expression. And in the landscape of family dysfunction, expression, even maladaptive expression, is significantly healthier than suppression. There are families where the dysfunction is silent, where the pain is never spoken, where the anger is never expressed, where the sadness is never acknowledged. In these families, the emotional life of the system goes underground. It becomes invisible. And invisible pain is the hardest pain to treat because nobody, not the family members, not the therapist, can see what they're working with. The Wattersons are not a silent family. When Nicole is angry, everyone knows it. When Gumball is anxious, it's visible in his behavior. When Darwin is scared, he shows it. When Aeneas is frustrated, she says so. When Richard is happy, the entire house vibrates with his joy. This emotional transparency, even in its most chaotic forms, means that the family's issues are on the surface. They're visible. They're accessible. A therapist working with this family would not have to spend months excavating buried feelings. The feelings are right there, filling the room, impossible to ignore. This is an enormous clinical advantage. Families that express their dysfunction openly, even messily, even destructively, are generally more responsive to therapeutic intervention than families that have learned to hide it. Because the first step in any therapeutic process is awareness, and the Wattersons are already aware. They may not understand what they're feeling or why, but they feel it, and they show it. That's a starting point. John Gottman's research on relationships identified not only the destructive patterns, the four horsemen, but also the factors that allow relationships to survive despite those patterns. One of the most powerful protective factors he identified was what he called repair attempts. The things partners do to de-escalate conflict and reconnect after a rupture. Repair attempts can take many forms: an apology, a joke, a physical touch, a change of subject, an acknowledgement of the other person's perspective. What matters isn't the form, but the function. The attempt to say, we are still connected, even though we just had a conflict. The Wattersons are prolific repairers. After virtually every conflict, after Nicole's explosions, after Gumball's disasters, after the family has been through another cycle of chaos and damage, there is a moment of reconnection. A hug, a shared meal, a joke that makes everyone laugh, a quiet moment where the family sits together and simply exists in each other's presence. And humor, specifically, plays a crucial role in this repair process. The Wattersons are a funny family, not in a performative, everything is fine way, but in a genuine, we share a sense of the absurd way. They laugh together. They find the same things funny. They use humor to metabolize experiences that would otherwise be overwhelming. This is not trivial. Research on humor as a coping mechanism, summarized by Rod Martin and others, has consistently found that shared humor strengthens social bonds, reduces the physiological effects of stress, and provides a cognitive framework for processing difficult experiences. Families that laugh together are, quite literally, more resilient than families that don't. The Wattersons' humor doesn't fix their problems, but it does something almost as important. It maintains the connection between family members across the ruptures that their problems create. Every laugh is a micro-repair. Every shared joke is a tiny assertion that we are still us, despite everything. And that ongoing assertion of connection, repeated hundreds of times across the life of the family, creates a tissue of resilience that holds even when individual interactions are damaging. The show, across its run, depicts moments of genuine psychological growth for every member of the family. These moments are typically small, often temporary, and frequently reversed by the next episode's comedic reset. But they exist, and their existence is clinically significant. Nicole has moments where she accesses vulnerability, where she lets her guard down, admits she's struggling, and allows herself to be comforted rather than being the comforter. These moments are brief, but they demonstrate that Nicole's avoidant defenses are not impenetrable. The capacity for openness exists underneath the armor. It just needs a safe enough environment to emerge consistently. Richard has moments of genuine competence, where he rises to a challenge, performs effectively, and demonstrates that his learned helplessness is not absolute. These moments are rare, but they're evidence that the developmental arrest we discussed is not a permanent condition. The capacity for industry exists in Richard. It's been buried by decades of conditioning, but it hasn't been destroyed. Gumball has moments of selflessness and emotional maturity that contradict his scapegoat role. Moments where he puts someone else's needs ahead of his own, sees a situation clearly, and acts with genuine wisdom. These moments suggest that Gumball's chaotic exterior is not the whole story, that underneath the attention-seeking behavior is a child who is capable of thoughtfulness, empathy, and growth. Darwin has moments of self-assertion, moments where he pushes back against Gumball's dominance, expresses his own preferences, and demonstrates that his identity is not entirely subsumed by his accommodating role. These moments are often uncomfortable for Darwin and for the system, but they're evidence of a developing autonomy that the codependent dynamic hasn't fully suppressed. And Anais has moments of genuine childhood, moments where she plays, where she's silly, where she forgets her parentified responsibilities and simply exists as the 4-year-old she is. These moments are precious because they demonstrate that Anais's inner child hasn't been fully consumed by the adult role she's been forced into. In clinical terms, these moments are called exceptions. Instances where the problematic pattern doesn't occur, where the client demonstrates the capacity for different behavior. Solution-focused therapists, following the work of Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg, build entire treatment approaches around identifying and amplifying exceptions. Because if a behavior can occur once, even briefly, even imperfectly, it can occur again. And if it can occur again, it can be cultivated into a new pattern. The Wattersons exceptions are small, but they're real. And they represent the raw material from which a competent therapist could build a different future for this family. If the Watterson family walked into a family therapy practice, here is what a competent clinician would likely recommend, based on everything we've analyzed. Step 1. Stabilize the marriage. Everything flows from the Nicole-Richard dynamic. Until the over-functioning, under-functioning loop is disrupted, the children's roles cannot change. Couples therapy, likely using the Gottman method or emotionally focused therapy, developed by Sue Johnson, would focus on reducing the 4 horsemen, increasing repair attempts, and helping Nicole and Richard develop a more equitable partnership. This would involve Nicole learning to delegate and tolerate imperfection, and Richard learning to tolerate the discomfort of competence. Step 2. Address Nicole's burnout and attachment. Individual therapy for Nicole, likely using a combination of cognitive behavioral and attachment-focused approaches. The goals would be to challenge her core belief that her value is contingent on competence, to develop her capacity for vulnerability, and to build emotional regulation skills that provide alternatives to the build-up-release cycle. Step 3. Address Richard's learned helplessness. Individual therapy for Richard, focused on behavioral activation, the gradual, supported development of competence through incrementally challenging tasks. The goal would be to build Richard's self-efficacy by providing him with repeated, undeniable evidence that his actions can produce positive outcomes. Step 4. Release the children from their roles. Family therapy focused on disrupting the rigid role assignments within the sibling subsystem. This would involve explicitly naming the roles: scapegoat, accommodator, parentified child, and creating space for each child to experiment with different ways of being. Gumball would be supported in developing calm, constructive forms of self-expression. Darwin would be supported in developing autonomy and self-assertion. Aeneas would be explicitly relieved of parental responsibilities and supported in reclaiming her childhood. Step 5. Build environmental stability. This is the step that the show's premise makes impossible, but that real-world treatment would require. The family needs a more predictable, more structured, more stable environment. Routines, expectations, and boundaries, applied consistently by both parents, would provide the external scaffolding that the family's internal structure currently lacks. These steps are listed sequentially, but in practice, they would overlap. Therapy is not linear. Progress in one area enables progress in another. Setbacks in one area create challenges in another. The work would be long, difficult, and non-linear. But with the resilience factors the Wattersons possess, it would be possible. Not guaranteed. Possible. And in psychology, possible is everything. We've been analyzing the amazing world of Gumball through the lens of psychology for hours now. We've applied diagnostic criteria, attachment theory, family systems models, and developmental frameworks. We've treated the Wattersons as real people and examined their dynamics with clinical rigor. But I want to step back now, way back, and ask a simpler question. Not what would a psychologist say about the Wattersons, but what is the show saying? Because the amazing world of Gumball, despite being a comedy, despite being aimed at children, despite being wrapped in absurdist humor and visual chaos, is making an argument about family. And that argument, when you strip away everything else, is remarkably simple and remarkably profound. The argument is this: love is not enough, but love is necessary. And sometimes, love combined with persistence, the sheer stubborn refusal to give up on each other, is what holds a family together when everything else suggests it should fall apart. The Wattersons should not work. By any clinical measure, this family is dysfunctional to a degree that would strain most relationships to the breaking point. The imbalance in the marriage is extreme. The children's roles are rigid and costly. The environment is hostile. The stressors are constant and severe. And yet the family endures. Not because it's perfect. Not because the problems get solved. Not because anyone has a breakthrough or a revelation or a moment of transformation that fixes everything. The family endures because, at the most fundamental level, these 5 people are committed to being a family. They keep showing up. They keep trying. They keep repairing the ruptures. They keep choosing each other, even when the choosing is hard. And the reasons for choosing are obscured by frustration and exhaustion and fear. This is not a naive message. It's not saying that love conquers all, or that dysfunctional families just need to try harder. It's saying something more honest and more complicated. That family is an ongoing act of imperfect commitment. That the people you love will hurt you and disappoint you and exhaust you. That you will hurt and disappoint and exhaust them. And that the measure of a family is not whether it avoids these failures, but whether it survives them. The Wattersons survive them. Every episode, every crisis, every explosion and disaster and catastrophe. They come back. They sit down at the table. They eat together. They watch television together. They exist in the same space as a unit. Not a healthy unit. Not a functional unit. But a unit nonetheless. A family. And there is something in that persistence, in the refusal to let dysfunction have the final word, that a psychologist would recognize as perhaps the most important psychological resource of all: the capacity to endure, the willingness to stay, the stubborn, irrational, clinically unjustifiable decision to keep trying when the evidence suggests you should stop. Psychology has a word for this. It's called commitment. And research by scholars like Scott Stanley and Howard Markman has consistently found that commitment, Not happiness, not compatibility, not the absence of conflict, but the decision to persist is the single strongest predictor of relationship longevity. The Wattersons are committed to each other, to the family, to the messy, painful, beautiful project of being together. And that commitment, more than any therapy technique or diagnostic framework, is what gives this family its best chance. So what would a psychologist ultimately say about the Wattersons? They would say this family is in distress. Real, significant, clinical distress. They would say that the patterns of behavior in this household are causing harm to Nicole's health, to Richard's development, to the children's emotional and psychological growth. They would say that without intervention, these patterns are likely to persist and potentially worsen. But they would also say that this family has resources, genuine love, emotional expressiveness, the capacity for repair, moments of authentic growth that demonstrate the possibility of change, and a commitment to each other that has survived everything the world has thrown at them. A psychologist would say that the Wattersons are not a hopeless case. They are a hard case, a complicated case, a case that would require patience, skill, and a willingness to work with a system that will resist change at every turn. But they are not hopeless, because no family that loves this hard and tries this persistently is ever truly hopeless. And maybe that's the most important thing the amazing world of Gumball has to teach us. Not about the Wattersons, about families in general, about all of us. That dysfunction doesn't mean defeat. That imperfection doesn't mean failure. That you can be broken and still be whole. That you can be struggling and still be strong. That the families we build, with all their chaos and pain and beautiful, stubborn persistence, are worth the work, every single time. If you've been drifting in and out of sleep, that's exactly what this video is for. The analysis will be here when you come back, and every time you return, you'll catch something you missed. A framework, a connection, an observation about a character you thought you knew. The Wattersons will be here too, in Elmore, doing what they've always done, getting it wrong, getting it messy, and getting back up. If this analysis resonated with you, if it changed how you see this show, or made you think about your own family in a new way, subscribe to Cartoon. We don't just watch cartoons here, we understand them, and there is always more to understand. Sleep well. We'll see you next time.